My name is Miller Files. I am a detective, and this is not a story about monsters hiding in the dark. This is a story about what happens when a system is so desperate for answers that it stops asking questions. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States was drowning in unresolved murder cases. Thousands of families waited for phone calls that never came. Police departments were buried under paper files. There was no national database, no DNA profiling, no digital trail, just photographs, witness statements, and hope slowly decaying in metal filing cabinets. Every unsolved case was a failure. Every open file was a reminder. And then one man started saying yes. His name was Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas did not arrive with evidence. He arrived with words he confessed again and again and again. At first, it sounded like a miracle. A drifter with no permanent address. A man already in custody. Someone with nothing to lose. Lucas told investigators he had killed a woman in Texas, then another, then another. He spoke calmly, sometimes eagerly, sometimes with tears. Each confession felt like closure. Each signature on a solved case felt like progress. But as I read through the earliest transcripts, something felt wrong. Lucas was not confessing like a man burdened by guilt. He was confessing like a man who had finally found an audience. Henry Lee Lucas grew up invisible. His childhood was a landscape of violence and neglect. His mother beat him, humiliated him, and taught him that attention came only through pain. By the time he was an adult, Lucas had learned one thing very well. If you wanted people to look at you, you had to give them something shocking. When police leaned forward in their chairs, Lucas leaned forward too. He described roadside murders, anonymous women, hitchhikers who vanished into darkness. The details were vague at first, but investigators helped fill in the blanks. They asked leading questions. They corrected him when he was wrong. They praised him when he matched the file. Slowly, a pattern formed. Lucas would confess. Police would verify just enough. A case would close. What no one wanted to admit was that Lucas was not traveling across the country committing hundreds of murders. He had no car, no money, no timeline. That made sense. But he had something far more powerful. He had what law enforcement needed most, a solution. Soon, Lucas was no longer just a suspect, he became a tool. Detectives from different states came to Texas. They brought photographs, crime scene reports. They showed him evidence before asking questions, and Lucas learned. He learned how to say the right thing. He learned when to nod. He learned when silence made people uncomfortable. For Lucas, confession was currency. Each story bought him cigarettes. Each signature bought him food. Each trip to a new police department bought him attention. Ottis Toole was not the mastermind. He was the echo, a man with his own history of violence and addiction, a man desperate to belong to something. When Toole confirmed Lucas's stories, investigators stopped doubting. Two voices telling the same lie sound like truth. Together, they became a machine, a confession machine. Hundreds of cases were attributed to them. Families were told justice had been served. Files were stamped closed. But no one asked the most important question. What if the wrong man was taking responsibility for the right crime? In this first chapter of the investigation, I want you to understand something clearly. Henry Lee Lucas was dangerous. Ottis Toole was dangerous. But the real danger was not what they did. It was what we allowed them to become. This is where the story begins. My name is Miller Files, and in this second chapter, We are no longer watching a confession unfold. We are watching a myth being built. Not a myth created by newspapers or Hollywood, but a myth constructed inside police stations, interrogation rooms, and tiny offices stacked with unsolved murders. It was a myth fed by hunger. The hunger for answers, the hunger for closure, the hunger for a name to write on a report so a grieving family could finally be told, "We caught him." To understand how Henry Lee Lucas became the center of one of the greatest investigative failures in American history, you need to picture the environment that allowed him to bloom. There is a common belief that monsters create chaos, but sometimes chaos creates monsters. Imagine a police department drowning in cases. Imagine a detective with a desk full of photographs, showing bodies left on roadsides, bodies in creeks, bodies behind abandoned buildings. Each one an open wound, each one a reminder of failure. Now imagine someone walks in and says, "I did this, and that one too." What would you do? What would anyone do? At first, Lucas was a curiosity, a strange man with a wandering past, rough manners, and a calmness that felt eerie. But then he started talking, not mumbling, not rambling, talking as if he had been waiting his entire life for someone to listen, talking as if stories poured out of him the way water pours out of a broken faucet. Detectives leaned forward. Lucas leaned forward, too, and every time someone asked, "Was this your work?" Lucas said yes. "I have spent years reviewing the earliest tapes and transcripts, and the detail that haunts me is not what Lucas said. It is what investigators told him. They gave him photographs. They gave him timelines. They gave him details that should have remained sacred. They believed they were guiding him toward the truth. They were actually teaching him how to lie more precisely. This was not an interrogation. This was a class. And Lucas was an eager student. Over time, the Texas Rangers created what they called the Lucas Task Force, a team dedicated to documenting Lucas's confessions. Detectives from across the United States traveled to Texas like pilgrims. They brought cold cases with them. They walked into the same room. They asked the same hopeful question. And Lucas delivered the same miracle. "Yes, I did it." He said it so easily that some believed they were witnessing a once-in-a-century serial killer. Others believed they had finally found the monster responsible for the scattered deaths haunting dozens of states. The truth was darker. They had found someone willing to be their monster. The more Lucas confessed, the more benefits he received. His prison meals improved. His cell was cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. Guards treated him like a celebrity. Reporters wanted interviews. Detectives treated him like a colleague. And Henry learned something profound. He learned that murder was not the commodity. Confession was. All he had to do was provide what everyone desperately needed, a story that fit. Do you know what scares me the most? How quickly people accepted it. In one case file, investigators wrote that Lucas must have killed a woman in Georgia because he described the color of her clothing correctly, but the color was visible in the photograph they showed him. In another case, Lucas was credited with a murder, even though he was proven to be hundreds of miles away at the time. The justification was chilling. One detective wrote that Lucas traveled widely and unpredictably, as if physics and distance simply bowed to his talent for killing. This wasn't police work. It was wishful thinking masquerading as justice. But Henry Lee Lucas did not operate alone. In this chapter, another figure steps out of the shadows. His name was Ottis Toole, and he was more than just Lucas's traveling companion. He was the reinforcement, the confirmation, the echo that made every lie sound like truth. Toole was a man who drifted through life as if nothing ever fully belonged to him. Not stability, not purpose, not even identity. When Lucas spoke, Toole followed. When Lucas claimed a killing, Toole sometimes nodded or added his own twisted memory. Investigators loved the consistency between the two men. They believed that agreement meant accuracy. In reality, it meant two lost souls building fantasies together for the first time in their lives. It is here, in this second phase of the investigation, that you begin to understand the real tragedy. Not simply that two manipulative drifters lied. The tragedy was that people in power believed them with enthusiasm, believed them because belief was easier than doubt. Families were told their child's killer had been caught. Mothers wept with relief. Fathers felt the tremble of closure in their chest. They could finally breathe again. They could finally sleep. They could finally imagine a world in which justice meant something. But justice is not a feeling. Justice is a fact. And the fact was that none of this was real. As I examine the files, case after case reveals the same pattern. Lucas told a story. Investigators nudged him along. Transportation records contradicted his claims. Distance contradicted his claims. Weather contradicted his claims. But none of that mattered because the story felt right. One ranger wrote a note that still chills me. He wrote, "Lucas gives us something we never get in these kinds of cases. He gives us certainty. But certainty built on convenience is a lie wearing a badge." In this second chapter, we watch the machine form. We watch as the hunger for answers mixes with the starved ego of a forgotten man. We watch as police departments from coast to coast surrender skepticism in exchange for satisfaction. A monster was being created, not out of blood, not out of violence, out of paperwork. The creation of the Henry Lee Lucas myth was not the work of a murderer. It was the work of a system that forgot the first rule of investigation. Trust nothing until it proves itself true. And in those years, nothing proved itself at all. Not Lucas, not Toole, not the case files that closed with the wrong names, not the confessions that contradicted reality, not the sense of justice that communities clung to. In this chapter, I want you to understand one thing. Before a system can be fooled, it must be willing to be fooled. And in the early 1980s, America was more than willing. My name is Miller Files, and in this third chapter, we are stepping into the moment when the entire structure surrounding Henry Lee Lucas began to crack. It did not crumble suddenly, it did not explode. It buckled slowly, like a house built on soft soil, sinking inch by inch until the foundation finally gave way. The collapse began with one simple observation. The truth could not keep up with the lies. For years, Lucas's confessions had been treated as gospel. Detectives felt relieved. Families felt closure. Supervisors saw their clearance rates rise. Everyone benefited from believing him, and no one benefited from questioning him. But the truth has a strange characteristic. It does not evaporate. It lingers in the shadows, remains in paperwork, hides in transportation records, sleeps inside old calendars, waits in weather archives. The truth has patience, lies do not. The first major fracture came from something deceptively small: mileage logs. A young reporter working for a small newspaper began comparing the dates and locations of Lucas's confessions. It was a task no police department had done. The reporter noticed that Lucas claimed to have killed someone in Florida on a date when he was verifiably in Michigan. On another occasion, he supposedly murdered a woman in California while simultaneously working a labor job in Texas. These contradictions were not subtle. They were enormous gaps, like missing pages from a book. This reporter did not accuse anyone. He simply asked, how did he travel that far, that fast? It was a question no one wanted to hear. Questions threaten comfort. Questions threaten certainty. Questions threaten closed cases. But once that question appeared, it did not go away. Soon, other journalists picked up the thread. They compared dates, distances, bus schedules, gas station receipts, and witness statements. The more they compared, the more the cracks widened. The truth was not bending. The story was bending. Inside law enforcement circles, two camps formed. One camp said the press was undermining solid police work. The other camp, smaller but growing, felt something cold in their stomach. They had trusted a man who should never have been trusted. While investigators argued, Lucas continued confessing. It no longer mattered to him whether anyone believed him. Confession had become his way of existing, his identity, his survival mechanism. He sat in interrogation rooms, smiling as detectives from different states arrived with folders full of unsolved murders. Some praised him for his honesty. Others seemed nervous, unsure of what to make of him. One ranger who met Lucas during this period wrote in a memo that the man seemed to shift personalities depending on who entered the room. When a detective wanted certainty, Lucas offered certainty. When a detective wanted remorse, Lucas acted remorseful. When they wanted precision, Lucas leaned forward and spoke softly as if delivering a sacred truth. But in the background, his mythology was breaking apart. The Texas Rangers, who had once championed Lucas as a miraculous case-solving tool, suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. Why had they taken him to crime scenes before he described them? Why were transcripts filled with leading questions? Why were inconsistencies overlooked? Why were hundreds of cases closed based solely on his word? There was another problem. Lucas had confessed to more murders than any human being could possibly commit, even with unlimited money, unlimited transportation, unlimited strength, and unlimited time. His timeline defied physics. His claims defied logic. But logic is rarely the priority when emotions are involved. When the cracks widened into fractures, the investigators began doing what they had not done before. They checked, they verified, they compared alibis. They traced bus routes. They requested employment records. They reviewed jail logs. They even studied the weather reports for specific dates to determine whether Lucas's descriptions matched reality. And the truth became undeniable. Lucas was wrong about the weather. He was wrong about clothing. He was wrong about locations. He was wrong about the type of vehicle. He was wrong about the cause of death. He was wrong about distances. He was wrong about timelines. He was wrong about everything except the parts detectives had accidentally fed him. The entire structure began to collapse. One by one, police departments withdrew their claims. Cases were reopened. Families that thought they had closure discovered they had been deceived. Some were forced to relive the original trauma. Others did not know how to process the news. How do you mourn twice? How do you grieve a second time? How do you look at the photograph of your lost child and realize the man you blamed was only pretending? There is a phrase used in law enforcement, confirmation bias. It means seeing what you want to see instead of what is actually there. In the case of Henry Lee Lucas, confirmation bias spread like a disease. Detectives believed him because it made their world easier. Supervisors believed detectives because it made their work appear successful. Politicians believed supervisors because solved crimes made voters feel safe. And then there was the public. They believed whatever they were told because belief is easier than doubt. As the truth resurfaced, the public grew angry. Angry at the police, angry at the reporters, angry at Lucas, angry at a system that had assured them justice was served when, in fact, justice had been smothered. Inside the prison walls, Lucas grew increasingly confused. He tried to retract some confessions. Then he retracted the retractions. Then he denied retracting anything. He was drowning in his own lies. Even he no longer knew which stories were real or which stories he had invented. He had become a man trapped between fantasy and reality, convinced that as long as people kept listening, he still existed. But something else was happening too. Ottis Toole's credibility began collapsing along with Lucas's. Many of Toole's confessions were also found to be impossible. Distances didn't match. Dates didn't align. Alibis contradicted. Claims. In one particularly painful case, Toole described killing a child in a way that contradicted every piece of physical evidence. Yet police had believed him because Lucas confirmed a detail in the story. The collapse was total. The Lucas task force was shut down. Investigators were reassigned. Some resigned. Some defended their actions. Some admitted they had been wrong. Years later, one ranger said in an interview, "We wanted so badly for him to be the answer that we stopped checking whether he even made sense." That sentence haunted me. We wanted so badly. It was the confession. The system never gave officially, but it was the closest thing to the truth. In the end, the collapse of the Lucas narrative did not bring answers. It brought chaos. It reopened wounds. It forced hundreds of families back to the beginning. It forced law enforcement to confront its own reflection. And the reflection was not flattering, because the truth had always been there, buried, ignored, overshadowed by the convenience of a confession. In this chapter, I want you to understand one thing. The collapse of truth is not loud. It is slow. It is quiet. It happens in paperwork, in contradictions, in ignored memos, in inconvenient timelines. It happens when a system built to seek the truth begins settling for comfort. And once truth collapses, rebuilding it becomes a burden too heavy for any one person to carry. But that rebuilding is where we must go next. This is where Chapter 4 will lead us. Not into the lies, but into the ruins, the lies left behind. My name is Miller Files, and in this 4th chapter, we walk into a landscape made of ruins, ruins of trust, ruins of justice, ruins of families that believed a lie because the truth was too delayed to save them. When the myth of Henry Lee Lucas collapsed, it did not expose a single mistake. It exposed an entire system in disarray, scattered like the ashes of a burned building. For the first time in years, investigators were not closing cases. They were reopening them. And reopening a case is far more painful than failing to solve it the first time. Because reopening does not start with hope. It starts with shame. It starts with doubt. It starts with the question no detective ever wants to face. What if we helped the wrong person? What if we comforted the wrong family? What if we allowed the real killer to disappear forever? Imagine a room filled with boxes. Boxes of files that had been stamped, cleared, now covered with bright red labels reading Review. Each folder represents a life, a face, a crime scene frozen in time. And now, those folders must be opened again, like wounds cut open to check whether they were stitched incorrectly. I spent weeks looking at the reopened files, and what struck me most was the silence. Not literal silence, but the emotional silence between the lines. A detective in 1983 writing that a mother finally found peace. A sheriff in 1984 telling reporters that his community could sleep again. A ranger sending a memo saying, "Lucas is the answer." And just below those words, now circled in red ink, the truth waited patiently. Those statements were not lies. They were beliefs. And beliefs, when shattered, leave deeper scars than facts. Families who had held funerals years earlier suddenly found themselves thrust into uncertainty again. Some had buried their children thinking justice had been served. Now they were being told that the man who confessed might not have even been in the same state when their loved one died. For many, it felt like losing them twice. One mother said in an interview, "I forgave the man who killed my daughter. Now they tell me he didn't. Who am I supposed to forgive now?" Her question still echoes in my mind. The work of unraveling the Lucas myth was slow and agonizing. Investigators were ordered to retrace timelines, re-interview witnesses, and examine cold case evidence with modern tools. Some detectives refused to participate. Others did so reluctantly, knowing they were reopening old failures. A few attacked the journalists, blaming them for stirring chaos. But chaos was already there. The journalists were just the ones willing to stare at it. Meanwhile, the real killers of many victims remained unknown. Some had died. Some had moved away. Some were still living normal lives, protected by the shield that Lucas unintentionally provided. When he confessed, he didn't just steal the truth. He stole the chance for justice. I reviewed a case involving a teenage girl found near a wooded area in Oklahoma. Lucas confessed to killing her. The family believed him. Years later, after the collapse, an investigator noticed that Lucas had described a storm on the night of the murder. The weather report showed cloudless skies. No rain, no thunder, no wind, nothing. The investigator went back through the file and found a piece of evidence overlooked for years. A shoe print that belonged to someone else entirely. That shoe print was never matched, and the murderer was never found. This was the pattern. Dozens, maybe hundreds of cases where the truth was lost behind paperwork. Lucas had not only confessed falsely, his confessions had erased investigative momentum. They had sealed doors that should have remained open. They had thrown detectives off paths that could have led to real answers. Toole's involvement had made matters worse. His confessions had supported Lucas's when convenient and contradicted them when inconvenient. This made both men seem like fragmented mirrors, reflecting whatever image the interrogators wanted. When Toole fell apart under scrutiny, the entire structure fell with him. Inside police departments, anger grew. Some officers felt betrayed by Lucas. Others felt betrayed by their superiors. Others felt betrayed by themselves. Imagine spending 5 years believing something with full sincerity, then waking up and realizing you had been walking in the wrong direction the entire time. It damages more than a reputation. It damages identity. One detective wrote in his resignation letter, "I cannot look the families in the eye. I cannot look myself in the eye either." The collapse also left behind political wreckage. Sheriffs had campaigned on high clearance rates. County commissioners had praised the strength of local law enforcement. Governors had cited Lucas's confessions as proof that their states were tough on crime. When the truth emerged, many quietly revised their statements. Some pretended they had never supported Lucas. Others distanced themselves from the Texas Rangers. A few admitted the failure openly, but the damage was already spreading like cracks in glass. Every collapse has its victims. In this case, The victims were not just the murdered, they were the living. The mothers who had to reopen old grief, the detectives who had to confront their own mistakes, the communities that lost faith in the institutions meant to protect them. The truth itself, battered and bruised like a survivor, crawling out of a wreckage. Inside the ruins, I found letters, some from families begging for answers, some from district attorneys asking for updates, some from citizens who feared their towns had become breeding grounds for evil. But the letters that struck me most were from law enforcement officers themselves. One wrote, "We stopped thinking. That was the first mistake." Another wrote, "We believed what felt right, not what was right." And another simply wrote, "We failed." Those 3 words remain the most honest part of the entire Lucas saga. But failure is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of accountability. And accountability is where this investigation must go next. Because in the ruins left behind, one question rises like smoke from a burned foundation. If Lucas didn't kill these people, then who did? This unanswered question is the shadow haunting every reopened file. And in Chapter 5, we step into that shadow. My name is Miller Files, and in this final chapter, we step into the darkest and most uncertain part of this investigation. The place where answers should exist but don't. The place where justice should have lived but never arrived. The place where the truth is nothing more than a shadow on a wall. When the myth of Henry Lee Lucas collapsed, many believed that the truth would naturally rise to take its place. That once the lies were stripped away, the real killers would finally become visible. That the reopening of cases would lead to new breakthroughs. That somewhere in the chaos, justice could still be salvaged. But reality is rarely that generous. The reopening of hundreds of cases did not illuminate the past. It revealed how much the past had been buried, evidence had been lost, witnesses had died. Memories had grown thin. Crime scenes had faded beneath time, weather, construction, and indifference. The trail that had once existed was now little more than dust. I entered rooms filled with boxes of forgotten files, labeled with names of victims who never got to grow old. Their stories had once been clear lines on a board. Now they were cracks in the wall, barely visible, but still part of the structure. One question haunted all of them. If Lucas didn't kill these people, then who did? There was no single answer. There was no hidden serial killer waiting to be revealed. There was no dramatic twist. What we found instead was far more unsettling. We found silence. Silence where leads should have been. Silence where follow-ups should have happened. Silence where justice should have lived. In some cases, the truth was simply unknowable. A truck driver who died years before the files were reopened. A drifter who vanished. A boyfriend who was always suspected, but never proven. A stranger who passed through a small town one night and disappeared into the highway's endless reach. In other cases, we found hints. Not answers, just hints. A mismatched DNA sample, a partial fingerprint, a name scribbled in a margin, a tip that had never been followed. But hints are not justice, and hints cannot heal the families who were forced to reopen their grief. I met a father whose son had been murdered in 1979. Lucas confessed to the killing in 1984. The father believed him because belief was all he had. When the confession fell apart nearly a decade later, the father looked at me and said, "Do you know what the worst part is? Not that Lucas didn't kill my boy. The worst part is that I'm too old now to wait for the truth." There was nothing I could say. Another family kept the original newspaper clipped to their refrigerator door. The headline read, "Killer Caught." They had lived 19 years in relief. When the truth emerged, They didn't remove the headline. They left it there. Not because they still believed it, because taking it down would mean admitting that justice had never truly come. In this line of work, people often assume closure is possible, that with enough time, enough determination, enough science, every answer can eventually be found. But the Lucas case taught us something brutal. Closure is a luxury, and not everyone gets it. Some detectives fought to rebuild these cases. They went back to the towns. They retraced the steps that once led nowhere. They interviewed people who could barely remember what they saw. They searched woods that had already been searched. Sometimes their efforts led to new suspects. Sometimes they led to new questions. Most of the time, they led nowhere. But nowhere is still part of the map. Nowhere tells its own story. The story of what happens when an investigation is abandoned too early. The story of how a false confession can bury the truth deeper than any grave. The story of a system that chose convenience over accuracy. The story of a lie that was comforting enough to silence the truth. Ottis Toole's myths collapsed along with Lucas's. Many families had believed Toole's confessions because they needed to believe in something. But when Toole's lies unraveled, they too were returned to the darkness, holding nothing but a question that would follow them for the rest of their lives. I remember walking down a hallway of cold case cabinets near the end of this investigation. The overhead lights flickered. The air smelled of dust and paper. Every drawer contained someone who had been forgotten. Every drawer was a quiet accusation against a world that moves on too quickly. And as I stood there, I realized something. Lucas and Toole were not the true villains of this story. They were symptoms. The real villain was the silence that grew every time a question was dismissed, the silence that flourished when a confession replaced an investigation, the silence that swallowed the truth until no one could hear it anymore. When people ask me what the Lucas case represents, I tell them this: it is a monument to everything that goes wrong when certainty is chosen over truth. Lucas and Toole stole the truth. Investigators buried the truth. Time erased the truth. And the truth, now fractured and scattered, lies in the shadows where only the brave are willing to look. In this final chapter, I want you to understand something that is both painful and necessary. Justice is not guaranteed. Truth is not inevitable. Closure is not a promise. Sometimes all we have is the search itself. Sometimes the search is all we can offer. Sometimes the search is the only way to honor the dead. I close this chapter not with an answer, but with a vow. As long as there are shadows, I will keep walking into them. As long as there are names buried in forgotten files, I will keep opening them. As long as there are questions left behind, I will keep asking. Because even when the truth is lost, the pursuit of it cannot be. My name is Miller Files, and this investigation does not end here. It never does.